wherever you may be around the world, and thank you for your company once again on Truth2U.org. That's truth2U.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counselling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Boy, we've had such a hiatus, Jono.
We really, in fact, we're playing tag. You've just been in Israel for a while. You've just come back. We're going to do a program, and then I'm off to Israel.
Okay.
How was it?
Awesome. That's all I can say. That you probably heard a New York accent there, but yeah, I mean, if you get me started, I'm just going to go on and start crying.
I don't want to make you cry. I don't want to make you cry.
There's nothing as special as Israel.
Give me two highlights. Two highlights. Is it that hard to choose two?
You know what? One thing that everyone knows this, everyone that goes to Israel knows this. You know, we go through our lives and, you know, we always live with a certain amount of serendipity and, you know, a sense that, wow, you know, look at how things seem to be choreographed in our lives. And everyone I speak to, they say when they go to Israel, they get that, you know, to the 10th degree. You know, it's a big city. I spent most of my time in Jerusalem. It's a big city. I don't live there. You know, it's not like I have millions of neighbors there. I'm visiting for the first time in 5 years, and yet I walk the streets, and every time I turn around, there's someone that I know. And so I happen to be friendly with Rabbi David Aaron. Many of your listeners might know him. So the last time I was in Israel 5 years ago, I was visiting in Machane Yehuda, the main shuk, the main marketplace in Jerusalem, which is a gas to go to. And then it was a late afternoon. I needed to go in and pray the afternoon prayers, so I popped into a little teeny synagogue, and I sit down, I turn around, and there's Rabbi David Aaron. And he says to me, he says, wow, he says, I never come to this synagogue. And I say, well, I certainly never come here.
No.
So that was 5 years ago. This year, so we went to, there's a new museum in Jerusalem, which if you have some time, because it was built in the time since you've been there last, right near the new Mashbir. I guess it's called Kikar Shabbat, off of the Midrachov, so it's King George and you know, all the street performers there.
Yeah.
It's right in the middle of Jerusalem. So there is a new museum of music, the Music Museum.
Jason was telling me about this on Israel on My Mind on our other program. Yeah, what did you think? It was good?
Fascinating. Well, it was not. I don't think it was fully done yet because they hadn't. I don't think fully set up all of the exhibits for different languages, but it was pretty completed. And
did they have a Bob Dylan exhibit?
Not yet. They basically what we saw were dozens and dozens of very ancient musical instruments going back,
truly.
You know, maybe thousands of years, some of them. And they so you had the instrument there. They had a description of it, and then there were headphones that you could wear and actually hear how this instrument would sound.
Wow.
And it was actually fascinating. And then actually they had, I couldn't understand why it was there. They had a room with a replica of the ancient temple, the second temple, and you could put on these, I guess it's called a virtual reality headset, where it was quite startling and dramatic, where you actually felt like you were literally walking in the temple. You could actually almost reach out and touch full-size priests that were walking by.
Wow!
It was overwhelming because it took you to a different, I guess, virtual reality. You know, I never had that on before, and it was sort of startling. I found it disorienting almost to be sitting in this seat and yet have all these things
in another world
taking place, but it felt very, very real. And anyway, it was an amazing experience. My wife and I were both blown away by this, and we actually did it twice because it was just so impactful. And then it got late in the afternoon, and I had to pray the afternoon prayers, or as we say, I got to pray the afternoon prayers. I had the privilege. And so right near this place is a very tiny, tiny little synagogue the size of my little office here. And I pop in, and I finish praying the afternoon prayers, and I turn around, and there's Rabbi David Aaron. So
what are the odds of that?
I felt like playing on the lottery, but it kept on happening. I would turn around and see this person. I would, go to this place and meet that person. I was trying to find my grandmother's grave in Jerusalem in a cemetery where you can't find anything. And just as I'm about to leave, someone comes running over and, gives me a phone number where they're going to just guide me by some computer system.
Wow.
So, I mean, and it just, you just felt like your life was, you felt the choreography of life, I think, in a more deep way in Israel. The Bible says that the eyes of God are on the land of Israel from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And so the sages speak about the idea that there is more divine providence that sort of is directed towards the land of Israel than other places in the world. And I always, whenever I go to Israel, I feel it. I feel it deeply. Another highlight, I mean, I had millions of them, but I had many personal goals that I wanted to accomplish there. One of them was not a happy one. After 9/11, after the attack on the World Trade Center, I felt that I actually had to go to Ground Zero. I felt that was holy ground. And about 9 months later, I went there, spent the whole afternoon there, and something similar took place this trip. Many people remember a number of years ago there was a horrible massacre at a synagogue in Jerusalem. And there were 4 people killed. One person actually was axed in the head, and he lingered for about a year, and he died a year later. That fellow was from Toronto, where I live. But the first person that was shot and killed was a classmate of mine. And 2 other people that were killed of the 4 people that I knew. So I felt for years now that I have to go to that place. I had to be there, and I had to just be present with the holy ground there. And so I made it a point of doing that. I got to see so many people that it's interesting that over the past 5 years I've gotten to know hundreds of people online, virtual friends, and I was able to connect with many of them for the first time face-to-face in Israel, which is to me always an incredible experience to upgrade a relationship from virtual to real. And I got the chance to spend time with, friends like Ira Michelson and his wife Leah, and with Rav Moshe, with Dror Moshe Kasuto in Israel and Jerusalem there. And so those, it was very full. It was, I kept a journal, and my wife and I were just seeing how every day felt like 10 days. Everyone that's gone to Israel knows that this is what it's like, and I just can't wait till I can go back.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'll tell you what, the listeners have missed you. I had a lot of people write in saying, hey, Psalm chapter 8, anytime? Which we are doing today, so it's wonderful to have you back. But I understand what you're saying, and I can't wait until I am there very, very soon. We are continuing in our series, exploring the book of Psalms, chapter by chapter, and asking the question, who composed the psalm? What is it about? What's happening in the life of the author at the time of the composition? How does it apply to us today? Also, what would Christianity have us believe about each psalm, and how does that deviate from the original intent? These are some of the questions that we've been asking, and I want to return to the Museum of Music that you were referring to, because our psalm kicks off, Psalm chapter 8. It says, to the chief musician, Now I have here on the instruments of Garth.
Did you say cheap? Did you say cheap musician?
No, yeah, just give it to the cheap musician. The budget is running low. To the cheap musician on the instrument of Garth. Now, is that an instrument known to the area of Garth, or is it an instrument? I've got another translation that says for the leader on the Gittit.
Well, the actual Hebrew is Gittit. Mm-hmm. And it's not really clear what this is referring to. First of all, it seems that the simplest way of understanding this is that this is a psalm that was intended to be played on an instrument that was called the Gittit. Although I don't know if anyone on the planet knows what this instrument is. There are many theories about this. Some people think that Gittit is not referring to an instrument per se, but the word gat in Hebrew is a wine press. And so some people think that Gittit is referring not so much to an instrument, but to a tune or a melody that people would sing while they were treading grapes in this wine press or gat.
Sure.
Some people think that Gittit is the name of a musical instrument, but it was from the city of Gat, which was in the area of the Philistines. There's a more elaborate theory, which is that we know that the Holy Ark was temporarily safeguarded for 3 months by someone named Oved Edom, who was a Gittite from the city of Gat. Mm-hmm. And so it happened to be there for 3 months. And then David, we know, then took the ark back to the city of David to be more permanently held. Mm-hmm. This is 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 10. And so one theory is that the Holy Ark became known as a Gittit, or that simply David associated this particular psalm with the Holy Ark, and some people suggest that he composed this particular psalm to refute people who deny the Torah, which was kept in the Holy Ark. It's interesting that we'll get to this a little bit later on in our discussion, but a lot is made of this idea of the wine press. And we'll see that some people will compare the Torah itself to a wine press, because in the same way that the grapes have to be crushed in order to yield, something that's drinkable, the Torah itself needs to be studied and analyzed and sort of crushed in order to yield ideas and thoughts. But Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, really alludes more to one of the things that this psalm will be discussing, which is, what's going to happen to mankind, at least the people among the mankind who resist God's agenda, who resist the Torah, who resist truth. And, he says that the idea is not that they're going to be crushed and destroyed like grapes, because he says that the grapes are not destroyed in a wine press. He says that what the wine press does is it brings out the tremendously wonderful contents that are locked up within the grapes. Mm-hmm. So he says that one of the things we're going to see in this psalm is that the way God will deal with mankind will ultimately be to lead them ultimately to a universal recognition of the truth. The God's agenda is not to destroy his opponents, right? We see throughout the Bible, like in Ezekiel chapter 18, right, where the prophet says that God's desire is not to destroy people who sin, but to transform them, to reform them.
But he has no pleasure in the death of the wicked.
Right. That's not what God wants. God, seeks really to have people transformed. And so the wine press is a symbol not so much of the destruction of the grapes, but really the transformation of the grapes into something that really is even more valuable than a grape itself. Fine wine will fetch you much more than, a whole bundle of grapes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's an illusion, according to some of these commentaries, that as we progress through this psalm, that, even people who are opposed to God and his agenda and his truths will ultimately be transformed by God. Mm-hmm. But there's no real clarity when we try to really, zero in on what does this mean when it speaks about this is to the conductor, either on this gitit, which would seem to imply that it's on an instrument, or regarding the gitit. So we have a number of possibilities, and maybe one day we'll know for sure.
Yes, no doubt. Well, it kicks off this way. It says, "O Lord, our Lord," and of course that's two different. We have the tetragrammaton there, and then is that Adoni?
So it's Adonenu, our Lord.
Our Lord.
Adonenu.
So if I could say Yud He Vav He, our Master, would be a fair translation?
That would be okay. Our Lord or our Master, yeah.
Mm. How excellent is your name in all the earth, and therefore, it's necessary to, in the English, to highlight the difference in those words. How excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower. Now I have a little lower than the angels. We're going to come back to that, of course. And you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. Michael.
That sounded beautiful. We're going to see that in this psalm, I don't want to go too much ahead, it really boils down to a tremendous paradox, or even something that seems impossible to really reconcile, because there are two themes that we're going to see develop in this psalm. One is that the majesty and the glory and the magnificence and the awesomeness of the universe makes man feel very small. I remember when I was in ninth grade, or I think it was eighth grade, I had a physics teacher named Mr. Finn, and he was describing to us how space is infinite. That if you just go out into space and you keep on going, it just doesn't end. And I remember I was a kid, but I remember I was trying to, I guess I was visualizing myself in a spaceship traveling and never getting anywhere. It just keeps on going and going and going. And I remember I in the middle of the class, I just started crying because it was hurting my brain. I just felt, this is crazy. How could the universe be so huge and vast? So one thing that happens in this psalm is it paints a picture of how vast and complex and grand and magnificent God's creation is. Every aspect of it, from the heavens to the earth to the creatures. And, in the face of this, we would feel very small and insignificant. And that's really what's painted in this psalm. We would feel that way. It's sort of normal. And in spite of the fact that, we are very small in the scheme of things, God places us on a very, very high level, right? As it says, even just a drop lower than angels. So there's this tension and a paradox between the smallness of man and
the value of man,
the greatness, the grandness of man. And so what's interesting is that this it begins here, I guess, in verse 2 in the Hebrew version. It really speaks about the fact that God's glory, and it's very hard to translate this word. You could translate this word as, I'm not sure how you read it, but it could be splendor or praise or honor or glory, that God's glory really belongs even above the heavens, meaning that. But in spite of the fact that his glory belongs beyond the heavens, but God in his great humility placed his majesty upon the earth. And that's what it says in the very beginning. It says, "Oh, eternal," or the Tetragrammaton, our Lord, how mighty is your name over all the earth, meaning that you place your majesty upon the earth. But the truth is that your glory or your majesty belongs even way beyond the heavens. And that's the question, meaning that, the earth in the scheme of things is one planet. And so if God's glory and majesty really transcends even the heavens themselves, what is it doing being placed down here upon little planet Earth?
How do we comprehend it? It's not, just as you were talking about.
It's going to hurt your brain.
Yeah, it's going to hurt your brain, because I was watching, and a shout out to my friend Ken Lane. I was on his Facebook page today, and he shared a video of the grandness of the universe, the map of the known universe, and watching, panning out from the Earth, past the solar system, out into to view the galaxy, and then other galaxies around us, panning out even further until eventually we have a map of the known universe. And there's been some discussion about this lately in the news. And then even posing the suggestion, of course, of multiverses beyond that of our own, makes you feel so small that you cannot comprehend it. And when you read these verses, it it doesn't help. How can we be so significant? How can God have made us so significant when we are but dust on a piece of dust in the grand scheme of things?
And it applies both to the earth, right? Meaning that why did God choose to center all of this activity here on planet Earth, right? Planet Earth is infinitesimally small in the scheme of the whole universe. And then, on planet Earth, why do we become significant? Meaning that, we're not as big as an elephant, and we're just one. Maybe we're smarter than other species. Maybe but maybe some people are. But that's part of the tension here. That we live in a vast universe, and and God's and God is beyond. Forget about these multiverses and universes and and the galaxies and it's infinite, and God is beyond that, right? And His glory is beyond that, and yet somehow He brings His majesty upon this earth. And one of the ways, what does it mean, by the way, when it speaks about God's glory? What is it talking about? And so one of the things that in rabbinic literature is understood is that it's referring to the Torah, that what God has placed upon the earth and given to mankind is His Torah. He's given us that. And that, on some level, is what makes mankind worthy, meaning that if we live up to that Torah, if we follow it, then maybe we are worthy of God's attention and God's elevating us. And, if we don't, if we ignore that, maybe we're not worthy of God placing all of this, greatness upon us. And so we'll get back to this idea of, even though ultimately God's glory is beyond the stratosphere, beyond the galaxies, he in His humility, He places His majesty, splendor, Torah upon the earth and gives it to human beings. And again, this is not a simple concept or idea, but I think it'll become clearer, hopefully, as we go through the psalm.
Should be mentioned as well, of course, David begins the psalm that way, and he ends the psalm that way. Oh Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. It's enveloped in that verse. And
we will see that, by the way, right, that he doesn't really end in the same way he begins.
Oh, true.
Right? Because the last verse truncates that first verse. Right? The first verse says, O eternal, our Lord, how mighty is your name over all the earth. You have set your majesty upon the heavens. But the last verse is, O eternal, our Lord, how mighty is your name over all the earth. Nothing there about the heavens. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to discuss when we get to verse 10 why, King David, only really, recapitulates part of that original verse.
Okay, we will get there.
Okay.
Well, verse 2, now I found this curious. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. Well, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, all we kind of get is crying or goo-goo-goo-ga. Yeah. Is this more of a referring to mankind in general? We're talking now about the greatness of God. Then is he seeing mankind in general as babes and nursing infants?
I'll give you my take on this. Mm-hmm. He's described, the magnificence of the universe, how incredible the world is, how vast it is. And, he speaks in this verse, this is the verse 3, speaks about putting an end to or silencing the enemy and the avenger, and, somehow out of the mouths of infants and sucklings you've established strength because of your tormentors. So somehow there's a setting one against the other. Somehow this phrase of the infants and the babies comes as a counterpoint to the tormentors and God's enemies and avengers. My take is this, that children are not cynical. They're not jaded. Mm-hmm. They see things often more clearly than adults. They experience the wonder of the world. And to them, the wonders of creation, are the wonders of creation. Children are just fascinated by the world. And they see, really, to them, the world is just an adventure. And, the people that, would deny reality, would deny truth, would deny Torah, would deny God, would just, approach, the world with a tremendous amount of cynicism and, skepticism and denial and blindness. So I think that that's what's happening in this verse. It's that, it's just these simple, pure, innocent babies that have not really had a chance yet to become cynical and jaded and skeptical and be in denial and be blind to the wonders of the world. They become sort of the answer, really, to these people who, the word in Hebrew is tzorarecha, tormentors, but it's from tsar means to restrict, to confine. It's related to the Egypt is Mitzrayim. It's very similar. It's a narrow space. And so you have, so many people that want to sort of constrict, the wonders of the world they want to put God into a box. They want to, Rabbi Shimshon Rav Hirsch says that there are people who they just don't have any room in their life for the spiritual, for the wonder. They're just jaded and they're miserable and they're negative and they have negative energy and they bring everything down. and they squish the life out of everything. Like you go to a party, everyone's having fun at the party, and there are people who just bring everything down. They just squeeze the life out of everything. And so, the kind of energy that opposes that is the vibrant, joyous, happy, wondrous, reality of just a child, a baby. They're just so pure and beautiful. That's really, on some level, I think, the antidote. Now, we know that this verse is quoted in the book of Matthew.
It is. That's right.
Yeah.
Matthew chapter, 21, verses 15 to 16. And it says, but when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that that'd be Jesus, did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, well, have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have perfected praise is what I've got, which is different to what I just read in Psalm chapter 8. Perfected praise
that's
as
sort of
to ordained strength.
It's sort of it's a mistranslation, but I wouldn't make a federal case out of that. But the question is, is this really
the application of the verse?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Jesus, takes this passage here in Psalms and almost turns it into a prophecy, which it's not. Clearly, the writer of the gospel is assuming that this verse in Psalm is about the Messiah and by extension about Jesus, which it's not. It's about praising God for his works, for his magnificent universe. And so, it's clearly an example. I mean, we did this when we were doing our series on Messianic prophecy. It's a verse which is basically being wrenched out of context. It's not really being applied in the way the verse is actually meant. If you want to be generous, you could say that Jesus is just quoting it very playfully, and he's not really serious about what the verse means. But then the question is, how would it then be an effective refutation or response to these people that are upset with him? It would not mean this to them. I mean, that you can only use a verse when everybody would agree on its meaning. So
this is not effective ammunition, is what you're saying. And if
I don't think so.
So he says this to them, and they're supposed to go, oh yeah, of course, oh, idiot me, of course. Sorry, continue.
So it has to have some. If you're going to use a verse, to make a point, everyone has to understand the point. Otherwise, it's sort of it's meaningless to use it. If it only has meaning to you,
then what is the point? It has to be contextually accepted to make an impact.
Yeah, I would say.
It continues on in verse 4. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers. That's interesting, isn't it? We usually have the work of your hands. Here we have the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained. What is man, that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him?
Right, that's the question we raised before, meaning that, right, when you think about the vastness of the universe, what's the significance of man? Meaning that why does man have any significance? There are a few things, actually. You point out that this verse speaks about the fingers of God, and usually the Bible refers to the hands of God. Some people say that, by using the expression of fingers, it's sort of stressing the idea of the complexity of creation. It's a very delicate work, meaning that, when you're looking at a work of creation, it's not simply a big bang that resulted in a mess, but it's intricate and it's carefully designed. I remember when I was, in high school, we were looking at, cell structures under the microscope. It's mind-blowing, and every element. I mean, look at just the structure, the intricate, nature of almost everything that's created, you get the sense here that there was almost a surgeon that was working on this. So that might be the reason that it speaks about the fingers of God.
Sure. And
it mentions here, interestingly, the stars and the moon, but it doesn't speak about the sun. What happened to the sun? So,
well, I suppose you could say. I mean, we understand the sun to be a star, but usually we have a separate mention of the sun, and that doesn't appear here.
I mean, it could be. I mean, I've seen many discussions about this. It could be that this is sort of like a very simple idea that we can gaze at the stars and the moon. You really can't gaze too long at the sun.
No, and you can't gaze at the stars and the moon and get a vague idea of the vastness of the universe if it's daytime. You've got to wait until the sun is down. Right.
Exactly. Now, what's interesting is that this idea of looking at sort of not just looking at, but contemplating really the heavens and the works of God's hand. We have many passages. For example, Psalm 104, verse 24. It says, "How great are your works, God? They were all made with wisdom. The whole the whole earth is filled with your possessions." The idea. Maimonides, for example, Moses Maimonides, he bases his whole, not the whole maybe, but he bases a large part of his thinking about the commandment to love God based upon this idea, meaning that he says, how does a person come to love God? And he says in his works that if a person just contemplates the vastness of the universe and how complex, not just vast, but complex it is, and how beautiful it is, it'll just thrill a person to come to love God. In the same way, I suppose, if you listen to beautiful music, I got to meet the composer. It's like, so this is a very popular theme, not just in the Bible, but in rabbinic literature. There's a famous story in the Midrash where a heretic comes to Rabbi Akiva, and he challenges him. He says, who created the world? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, God did. And the heretic says, well, prove it to me. So Rabbi Akiva says to him, what are you wearing? And the fellow says, I'm wearing a tunic or whatever he was wearing. Rabbi Akiva says, well, who made it? And the fellow says, well, it was made by a tailor. And Rabbi Akiva says, well, prove it. So the fellow says, what do you mean prove it? He says, it's obvious it was made by a tailor. Who else would have made it? So he says to him, well, if it's obvious to you that, a garment that you're wearing must have been made by someone, then obviously the whole universe that we're inhabiting must have been made by someone. It doesn't just, come into existence. There is a famous, parable that's told about, again, a skeptic who comes to a philosopher and, is questioning the existence of God. And he says, no, I don't believe in God. The world just came into existence. And the philosopher changes the topic and then walks over to this beautiful painting on the wall and is looking at it. And the skeptic says, wow, that's an amazing painting. Where did you get it? So the philosopher says, well, it's interesting. What happened was this was a blank canvas that I had in my house. And there was an earthquake here years ago, and it knocked over all these cans of paint in my house, and it formed this beautiful painting. And the guy says, that's ridiculous. He says basically it's impossible, for a paint factory to blow up and to produce the Mona Lisa. And so the philosopher says, look, whenever you see something that looks designed, there's a designer. It doesn't happen by accident. And so, this has always been a very, very important and critical, approach to really thinking about the idea of a creator that designed and formed the world. But then, as you say in verse 5 here, if we have such an incredibly vast and complicated and grand and a world that just is so big it can give you a headache. So really, what is man that God even can remember him or think about him, or the Son of Man that God will remember him? I think that given the vastness of the world, what is the significance of man? I mean, are we really that special? If you just look at us, we're just maybe an ape that has a few more brain cells. It's hard really to understand, in the scheme of things, why are we so significant? By the way, it's interesting that the previous verse, speaks about the grandness of the universe, and this verse here really speaks about the idea that it should instill in us a feeling of humility and smallness. And the Chafetz Chaim, a great sage who passed away in the year 1933, he said it's ironic that so many great scientists who were probably the most aware of the greatness, the vastness of the universe, they're often the most arrogant and skeptical.
Now, with that in mind, and this is, I think, perhaps the most curious verse in this chapter, and this is verse 6. For you have made him a little lower than, and as I mentioned before, I have in my translation, the angels. And that's generally the translation that I see. It goes on to say, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. Now, that word is not angels, though. What do we have there?
Well, it could be angels, meaning the word itself is written in Hebrew as Elohim. Elohim is usually a term that's used to describe God. It's the word in Genesis chapter 1 that's used during every day of creation. But the Hebrew, literally, El means power. For example, I think it's somewhere in Genesis chapter 34 where I think it is Jacob's father-in-law who Laban says, because he's chasing after Jacob, he's upset that Jacob, skipped town, right? But he says, Yesh le'el yadi, right? There is strength in my hand. Now, El usually means is a term for God, because the ultimate power, the ultimate strength is God.
Oh, okay.
But, right, the word itself, though, simply means power.
Yep.
For example, judges are sometimes called Elohim.
Well, now we have this. There's the example in Psalm chapter 82, right? We have God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. Now we have gods there in my English translation with a little g. That's Elohim. Further down in verse 6 or 7 in 82, I guess perhaps in the Hebrew, I said, you are gods, that's Elohim, and all of your children are of the Most High. It goes on, but do we have another example of where Elohim is translated in the English as angels? Generally speaking,
there is one, and I'm just
because we do have Elohim
I know where.
Translated as judges. Yep, you were saying.
Well, again, it depends who's doing the translating. But I think if we go to Genesis chapter 6.
So the Nephilim, is this where we're...
Okay, so...
so...
Yeah, so it's the word, it's in chapter 6, verse 2. The sons of the rulers saw the daughters of men. Now, it's literally the sons of Elohim.
Now, in the English translation here, I do have that the sons of God, capital G, saw the daughters of men, so on and so forth. But that's not necessarily the way that it's translated.
So this is usually translated as rulers or mighty people. I was wrong. It's not translated as angels there. I do remember coming across at least one example.
There's another example where Moses is trying to get out of his appointment, and God's getting cranky with him. He says, "Look, I can't talk," and he says, "Your brother will be
your prophet." But he says that you, Moses, will be God.
That's right. He says you will be Elohim to Pharaoh.
Right. That's chapter 7, verse 1 in Exodus.
Now, could it be understood to say that you will be... Because we have a perfectly good word for messenger.
Malach. Well, again, the word literally means powerful or with authority. And that's why it's used for judges. It's used for Moses because he's going to be someone that has authority over Pharaoh. Again, it's not a proper name for God, which the Tetragrammaton would be. So Elohim is often used for God because there's no power or authority like God. But we see because it's used in so many other contexts, it can mean human beings that are in a position of authority or power. I think in Psalm 82 that you were quoting, it's usually translated as God-like. Obviously, they're not God, but they're God-like. B'nai Elohim, I think that it says. So, when we're looking at this verse here, I think it's verse 6 in Psalm 8 here, who is it saying that man is created a little bit lower than? I think one of the reasons why using the word angels is much more meaningful is what would it mean to say that human beings were made a little bit lower than God? I mean, it's hard to...
That is the question. So if that's the way we take it, then what does that mean? Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. We're not a little bit lower than God. We're infinitely lower than God. So to say that we're a little bit less than the angels, it's a interesting question because in Jewish literature, human beings are seen as both greater than angels and not as great as angels. It's interesting that in the book of Zechariah and Zechariah, in the beginning of the book, I forget which chapter, maybe chapter 2, it speaks about God placing us, or the subject of the sentence, as mehalchim, walkers, bein ha'omdim, between those who stand still. And the angels are referred to as omdim. They are stationary, they're static. And human beings are referred to as mahalchim. They are goers, walkers, because the angels are static. They don't have free will. They're created by God as spiritual beings that don't really have free will. They simply, do what God tells them to do.
They act when they're commanded to act. Yeah,
right. God says jump, and they say how high, and that's it. They're simply like Jaime the robot from Get Smart. Right? They do exactly as they're told, and they're not moral creatures because they're not tempted. They don't have free will. The human being, is considered to be greater than the angels for that reason because we have to choose to be obedient, and it's that choice that makes us virtuous. There's no virtue in a robot carrying out its commands. There is virtue in a human being having to overcome a tremendous amount of resistance to be obedient. If, for example, the Bible had a commandment that would say, don't eat radioactive waste. So who in the world wants to eat that? But if God says, don't eat things that could be very delicious, it takes a certain amount of,
decisive willpower.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have to overcome a lot of resistance.
Yeah.
So the human being is in some ways greater than the angels, but in some ways the angels are greater. They're more spiritual. They're more perfect, if you want to use that word. They don't have weaknesses. So it's sort of a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other kind of comparisons. But it would make sense to speak about creating human beings a little bit less than the angels, having a little bit less, in our potential, or in terms of who we are. We can't see angels as greater, possibly, but to speak about being just a little bit less than God is a bit absurd.
If in fact that is what the intention of the word was, I mean, when we look at 82. It can be, Psalm 82, I believe it can be rendered as judges, Elohim there. I just wonder if there's another more appropriate word, only because angels, we have a perfectly a good word for messenger that could have been used. Elohim, as you pointed out, El being power, Elohim being the plural, mighty powers, perhaps. You made him a little lower than the mighty powers. And just that we're talking about the observance of the vastness and majesty of the universe at night, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, and yet you have made him a little lower than the mighty powers. It's just something interesting to I think, meditate on. What does this possibly mean than just to accept the word in the English as angels?
Oh, for sure. It's not a slam dunk. By the way, in Genesis 1:26, when God says, "Let us make man in our image," the question there is, who is God speaking to?
Yes.
So one of the most common answers is that God is speaking to the angels that were created. And, so you could say that, look, in that the sense, angels here.
Yeah, by extension, we could easily translate that. I think with some justification, we could translate that as angels, and we back that up with what verses in Isaiah chapter 6 and I think Malachi as well, talking about the royal assembly before God, and
right.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I think that's fair. But nevertheless, it's worth letting people know that the word there is Elohim. And it goes on to say, "And you have crowned him, man, with glory and honor." Verse 7, "You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet." Is it worth mentioning, by the way, should we mention it yet, or do you want to come back to this? This is loosely quoted in Hebrews in the New Testament.
I didn't realize that.
That's not on your radar at the moment. We have this.
I missed that.
Well, you'll know the verse. It's the passage. It's Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through to 9, and it's subtitled. And of course, this isn't in the text, but in the New King James, it's subtitled "The Son Made Lower Than Angels." Now, in the Greek, we do have angels. In the way that they've translated it, but it says, "For he has not put the world to come of which we speak in subjection to angels, but one testified in a certain place, saying, What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you take care of him? You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with the glory and honor. You have set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet." It continues to say, "For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not under him. But now we do not yet see all things put under him." Boy, this is a real... but
it's a tongue twister.
It's a tongue twister. But we see Jesus, who was made now it applies this to Jesus again as a messianic prophecy fulfilled. We see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of the death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. The interesting thing, of course, is that if that was the my New King James Bible is highly Christologically slanted, and yet when it says in verse 5 that the Son of Man, who is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him, usually you would have a capital S for Son.
Yes.
But they don't do that here. They don't do it. But when it is applied in when it's referenced in Hebrews, it seems to be the writer of Hebrews would have us believe that this is about Jesus.
It's interesting also that translation you read, or that version, takes the word Elohim there as angels. And I would find it strange. I shouldn't say strange. It's interesting to me that they would speak about Jesus as being made lower than the angels, because that's sort of not what you often would expect from at least a high Christology, where Jesus is seen as, God in the flesh, God himself. So it's I always find this to be one of the big confusing issues in the Greek scriptures in the New Testament. Do they really see Jesus as God or as less than God?
It depends on the day, really, doesn't it? And the author. From one book to another, it just seems to go back and forth.
Well, even within authors, Paul himself seems to vacillate on this. I don't think anyone knows for sure. The current scholarship does not attribute Hebrews to Paul. It may be a student of Paul or someone that was Pauline. But here, it's interesting here that this passage would speak about Jesus as being even lower than the angels. I don't think that they would. I think they would be thrown out of most evangelical churches. Who's
Well, I think they would have been thrown out of the Council of Nicaea. I think we saw that happen. This was one of the hot topics on the agenda there. But in any case, we'll return back to our psalm.
Yes, so it's interesting. This verse here, verse 7, which speaks about having given man dominion, right, over the works of God's hands. By the way, here is interesting. It speaks about the work of God's hands, not the work of his fingers. So it's interesting that earlier on it used the work of his fingers. Yeah.
Now, it can't be argued that we do have the ability. It's not as if we can just go up to a lion and just because we're human that we can tame the lion or have dominion over the lion. But we have the ability, I think, is well established to have dominion over the animal kingdom, generally speaking, and to some extent, nature. We are able to manipulate things in our favor. He has put all things under our feet, and it goes on to say, sheep and oxen and beasts of the field, birds of the air and the fish and so on and so forth. You were going to say the Talmud says.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Genesis 1:26, which you mentioned before, speaks about two elements. It mentions that man is created in the image of God, and then it goes on to say right away in that verse, in Genesis 1:26, that God gave man dominion over the earth, over the creation. And so here in this psalm, verse 6 speaks about the fact that man was made with this greatness. I mean, when it says that we were made a little bit less than the angels, that's, putting a big feather in our cap. It's not speaking about the smallness of man. It's speaking there about the greatness of man, which would be parallel to the idea that God breathed into the human being the breath of life and we have a divine soul, and therefore we're in the image of God. And here in the very next verse, after speaking about how we're just a little bit lower than the angels, boom, we were given dominion over the works of creation. And in Genesis 1:26, we're created in the image of God, and then God puts everything under our hand in our dominion. But there's a caveat. And the caveat is that even though we were given dominion, we have to keep something in perspective. The Talmud in Tractate Brachot, it's the first volume of the Talmud, at page 35a, finds two verses in the book of Psalms that seem to contradict. If you go to Psalm 24, verse 1, it begins by saying, La Hashem ha'aretz u'mula, to the Almighty, to the Lord, belongs the earth and the fullness of it, meaning that God really owns, because God created the world, God owns the entire world. And it uses the word aretz, the earth itself. So the entire earth belongs to God. But in Psalm 115, verse 16, it says, Hashemayim shemayim lashem, v'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. The heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he gave into the hands of mankind. So the Talmud is a bit bothered by this and says, well, which is it? Does the earth belong to man, as it says in chapter 115, or does the earth belong to God, as it says in chapter 24? So they resolve this apparent contradiction by saying that one verse is speaking about reality before we say a blessing. The other verse is speaking about reality after we say a blessing. I think that the idea of a blessing is for us to acknowledge where it comes from and who the real owner is. So the truth is that everything really does belong to God. And he only gives it to us for us to be stewards over if we acknowledge that we received it from him. If we walk around with the illusion that we are the real masters and the true masters, and that it really ultimately belongs to us, then we don't really have this dominion. The dominion is given with a caveat. And the caveat is that we have to understand where our dominion comes from. Otherwise things can be very dangerous. When human beings think that they own the world and we can do whatever we want, we see what happens. We see, for example, so much environmental destruction going on because there are people who really think it belongs to me. I do whatever I want. Mm-hmm. And they don't have a sense of responsibility to a higher power. And so, one of the amazing, teachings in the Bible and in rabbinic literature is, teachings about ecology and in the environment. And they go back thousands of years. I mean, when I was growing up in the 60s, I never even heard this word ecology. I never knew the word existed. And yet, to the Bible, and philosophically and spiritually, this is a very, very important concept. There's a famous rabbinic midrash which says that after God created the world, he took Adam by the hand and he led him through the Garden of Eden, and he said to Adam, "Look at this beautiful world that I put you in." He said, "Be very, very careful not to destroy it in any way, because if you do, there'll be no one to fix it after you." So we have a tremendous amount of responsibility as not the owners of the world, but as the stewards of the world. And so, this verse does speak about God giving us dominion, but it's not carte blanche. It's not, for us to ever believe that we're the true ultimate owners.
It continues on saying, as I mentioned, it just gives the examples, all the sheep, the oxen, beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish in the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. And as I mentioned before, then it ends with the way it began. But as you mentioned, without the second part of verse 1, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. And you were going to make a comment on that.
Yeah, I found something very, very beautiful from Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib, where he discusses this. And he says that, as I just mentioned, that it's true that God has entrusted his creation to us, which is an amazing thing. I mean, the psalm was speaking about how immense this world is, how vast it is, how grand it is, how complex it is. And then the next breath, it says, and God made us have dominion over it. You think about it, it's like mind-blowing. But, and there's a big but here, we have to fulfill the responsibilities that we were given. And the question is, are we able to? Meaning that God, it's a trust that it's a holy trust that God has given us, a holy mission to be the stewards over the creation. And the question is, are we able to really fulfill that responsibility? So Rabbi Weinrib refers us to a passage in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, page 88b. Where it seems to say that God thought that human beings could fulfill our responsibilities, and that's why he gave us the Torah. Meaning that the whole reason he gave us the Torah was as the guide for us to help us responsibly be in charge of this world. And the Talmud tells an amazing story. The Talmud says that when God intended to give the Torah to human beings, the angels in the heavens objected. And they felt that God's Torah was too sacred and too holy to be entrusted to mere mortals. They felt that the Torah should remain in heaven and that human beings would sully it, would cheapen it, would dirty it. And so in this passage in the Talmud, that they quote the angels as saying, Lord sovereign, how glorious is your name in all the earth. Your splendor, meaning your Torah, is praised as high as the heavens, which is basically verse 2 in our chapter, meaning that the Talmud has the angels reciting this verse in the beginning of this chapter. And the way that it's understood is that the angels are saying that God, your name is glorious in the entire earth, in all the earth, and your splendor, or they understand it to mean the Torah, is praised as high as the heavens. And what they're saying is, and you should leave it in the heavens. Leave the Torah in the heavens. Do not let it be sullied and dirtied by mere human beings. So that's what happened when God was about to give the Torah to Moses. So in this passage in the Talmud, God turns to Moses and says to Moses, "Nu, what do you say to the angels?" So Moses turns to the angels and he asks them, well, what does it say in the Torah? You don't want God to give the Torah to human beings, and you think it should stay up in heaven. Well, what does the Torah say? So I'm going to share what happens here in this fascinating discussion. So Moses says to them, well, it says in the Torah that in the first of the Ten Commandments, I'm God, your Lord, who brought you out of Egypt. So Moses turns to the angels and says, did you go down to Egypt? Were you slaves to Pharaoh? Why should you have the Torah? And then he says, what else does it say in the Torah? So it says in the Torah, do not have any other gods before me. It's also in the Ten Commandments. So he says to the angels, do you live among people who worship idols? That you need to be warned against worshiping idols? And then Moses asks them rhetorically, what else does it say in the Torah? It says, remember the Shabbat to keep it holy. So he says to the angels, do you then work during the week that you need to have the concept of the Shabbat? And what else does it say in the Torah? It says, don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, the prohibition against swearing falsely. So he says, where do you come to swear? What kind of arguments do you angels have? He says, do you have business dealings that you have to argue and take oaths? What else does it say in the Torah? Honor your father and your mother. Do you have a father and a mother? What else does it say in the Torah? Do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Is there any jealousy among you? Do you have an evil impulse that you have to be told not to murder and not to commit adultery? So what happens at the end of Moses' impassioned defense is that the angels sort of give in. And it's very clear that the Torah was not meant to be kept in the heavens. Obviously, it belongs precisely on the earth. That's what it was meant to do. It was meant to really help human beings living on the earth live more holy lives.
Well, as it is written in Deuteronomy chapter 30, we have it in verse 12. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us that we should hear it and do it, nor it is beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you in your mouth and in your heart that you may do it.
Beautiful. So in this passage, God agrees with Moses. He gives the Torah to Moses, and therefore the psalm ends with just the first half of verse 2, without the plea of the angels, right, who were saying, that your splendor is praised as high as the heavens. That is not here at the end of this psalm. It just ends by saying, how glorious is your name in all of the earth, because that's where the Torah belongs. Mm-hmm. And that's, according to Rabbi Weinrib, why verse 10 here only quotes half of the verse.
Interesting. I have to say, it's difficult to reconcile the concept of angels not having free will and the goings-on of that story. I'm not too sure that's one for the listeners to consider.
Well, the story actually requires a much deeper study, because when you think of it, Moses' response to them is sort of too obvious. Meaning, what were the angels thinking? That they should be, the Torah belongs in heaven where, it's really meaningful to them. So it's not easy to understand on a sort of when you penetrate beneath the surface of this story, what's going on, because the Moses, shooting them down is sort of like duh. It's like too obvious. But the learning how to read midrash is an art form, meaning that it's never a good strategy to take these midrashim, these stories, literally. A famous rabbi once said, if you take it literally, you're an idiot. And if you say that it's ridiculous, you're not so smart. So,
what you're saying is that there's something in it for everybody.
The point he's making, that they always make, is that when we read these midrashim, these stories in the midrash, the Talmud, the point is not to get too hung up with understanding, how does it work, and is it true? Did that really happen? But what are they really trying to teach? What's the lesson that they're trying to teach? That's always really the goal of studying these texts.
And that is that's the end of our. That's where we leave it. That's it. We've put the icing sugar on another cake. How's that?
That's all, folks.
That's all. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to Israel. I'll be back in a few weeks, and God willing, we will do Psalm chapter 9, hopefully before Hanukkah. What do you reckon?
God willing, we'll do that, and I wish you a bon voyage, a safe trip. I'm so jealous of you because I wish I could be there again. But, I think you're going to have an amazing time. I'm sure you will. And all the people on the tour with you. And I'll be thinking of you, and I'll be thinking of all your fellow travelers. And I'm sure it's going to be an incredible time in the Holy Land.
It's going to be great. I will tell you all about it, and it's wonderful to have you back again, Rabbi Michael Skobac, Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Thank you for coming back on the program, my friend.
Thank you for being with me and having me.
Always a pleasure. And until next time, dear listeners, be blessed, be set apart by the truth of our Father's Word. Shalom.